the other gubernatorial election, obviously, that I think is particularly interesting when it comes to gun policy is New York. Now, this is another situation where Lee Zeldin, the Republican there running against incumbent Kathy Hochul, is not his campaign messaging has not been primarily focused on guns, right? It's more crime and inflation and the economy. But it seems that Hochul has, of course, you have this is another state where they passed significant gun legislation before the election. Hochul got pushed through the response to the Supreme Court striking down the state's old gun carry law, and the response is now mired in court battles as well, and has been found unconstitutional by two separate federal judges there. And interestingly, Hochul is the one who seems to be pivoting towards guns at the end of this race as polls have tightened as a sort of response to the crime accusations from Zeldin, which is something that you've seen the gun control groups advocate for, connecting those two issues. But she seems to be the only really prominent candidate in a tight election that's actually doing that. And it doesn't seem to be helping to this point, at least in the polling. What's your take on that race?
Well, a few important points in New York. Number one, New York is a state that if you polled the voters, if you had a referendum on gun control, it would pass overwhelmingly. It's a blue state, needless to say. It's a state where, what you're seeing Governor Hochul do is trying to make the crime issue about gun control. I don't think it's working. I think people realize that, and we saw this debate, the big debate that the two candidates had in the past few weeks, where the governor was trying to make it out to be a gun control issue, and Lee Zeldin was saying, look, it's not just guns. People are getting pushed in front of subway trains in New York City. People are getting assaulted, and the Jews are getting assaulted on the streets of Crown Heights. This is not just the rise in crime, the rise in violent crime even is not just a gun issue. And she didn't have a particularly compelling response to that. So that's an interesting little sidebar to the whole gun debate, because the number one issue in a lot of these New York governor's race polls is crime. And I think you said Hochul is, and I haven't followed every race super close, to that granular effect, but you said Hochul was the only Democrat who's trying to make the crime issue about gun control. I've heard the Biden White House kind of trying to do that recently,
sure,
where they're trying to, they know they have a big disadvantage in the polling when it comes to crime, but they think they have an advantage when it comes to gun policy in certain areas, especially certainly New York, they do. So what you're seeing is they're trying to change the subject. The problem, as I said, with Hochul's strategy is that, I think a lot of voters, even, non-Republican voters, swing voters, Democratic voters who are feeling the pinch of crime, they don't see this as a gun issue. I think they see this as a New York City is out of control issue, that you can't walk in the streets without the fear of being mugged issue. And there's a little bit of tone deafness coming from the Governor Hochul, about the crime problem. I think they agree with her on guns and gun control, but that's not the issue at hand. And she is sort of, in recent weeks, almost denied that there is a crime problem, to the point where that's become a major issue, than a more important issue, a more important focus than the candidates' positions on gun control.
Right. Yeah. She had that remark about, wondering why Zeldin cares so much about the crime issue during the debate, which was not a shining moment for her, I don't think. But yeah, certainly this is the strategy that she's employing, that Everytown has advocated for publicly, right? They put out a bunch of polling that they say where they're making the case that Democrats should try to connect these issues. The White House has done it to some extent, but I haven't really seen it as a actual focal point of a campaign in a lot of places. And certainly you could argue that's not the focal point for Hochul or Hochul. Sorry if I mispronounced her name earlier, but certainly it's something that she's definitely attempted to pivot to, and that was clear in the debate and in her social media messaging during the debate, that she wants the crime issue to be seen as a gun issue. But yeah, it is an interesting point whether or not that's actually working, and certainly the polling indicates that he's closing on her still, and that would be a huge upset, right?
Huge upset. That would be the upset, the shocker. We're talking about it, so it's not totally off the radar from the press, from the media. But for a state that voted for Democrats by over 20 points, to be competitive in the governor's race. With, like you said, Stephen, Lee Zeldin is not exactly like your Rockefeller moderate Republican. He's a pro-Trump Republican who, didn't vote to like confirm the election results in Pennsylvania and Arizona. He comes across as a very mild, very he has a good manner about him. He can appeal to these suburban voters because he doesn't look like Jim Jordan or Marjorie Taylor Greene or some of the more right-wing lawmakers. But in terms of his voting record and his position vis-a-vis Trump, he is not a moderate Republican. He's not an anti-Trump Republican. So the fact that I think a lot of folks assume that because of his ties to Trump, he would be unelectable in a state like New York. And as it's turning out, Governor Hochul's disconnect from the biggest issues facing New York voters, crime number one, is causing her to lose the political altitude that the Democratic Party typically has.
Yeah, and Zeldin hasn't run away from the gun issue necessarily. He's been on record as criticizing her decision to pass the new gun carry law, and they do have a contrast in their stated positions. He's just not really trying to make it an issue. It's more what she's trying to do. And I think there's another important point here about perception, right? Perception is what's going to really rule the day in politics, right? If Hochul wins, but she only wins by a couple points, when it comes to this late strategy of trying to shift towards gun control, that'll probably be viewed as a loser, right?
Well, look, it's kind of like the debate over like what's the most like abortion versus the economy, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at the polling, more Americans now identify as pro-choice, and there's a pretty clear majority of like voters across the country in swing states supporting abortion rights, right? But when you actually ask voters what's a more important issue, the economy, inflation, or abortion, the economy wins by a landslide. So, there are cross currents in our politics. And like I was saying before, most New Yorkers probably are well to your left, and they're well to the left across the country when it comes to gun control, right? But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean if you have a choice between trying to put more police on the streets, trying to change New York's bail law, which Lee Zeldin, New York passed a bail law in 2019 that made it easier for criminals to get out of, to not serve time and to recommit offenses on the streets of New York. And if you ask them, is that a bigger problem for your average New York voter, or is the gun policy in New York a bigger problem? Well, I think you're seeing that Zeldin's focus on the bail law is a much bigger concern, a much bigger a much bigger problem for Democrats. I mean, New York, by the way, as you noted, Stephen, New York has pretty strict gun control laws as is. So it's kind of like, if you're in a blue state where abortion rights are already protected, you may not be as worried about, what a Republican would do to abortion laws in the state. Same thing with gun control. Like, Democrats are controlling the legislature. There's not public support for change, for loosening gun laws, and there's not the votes for that, in Albany. So, I think people realize that gun policy is not going to change, or some people would realize that gun control is not going to be an issue that's going to change if you elect a Republican to the governorship.